Great. So yeah, you say you want a revolution. I'm going to be talking about really the big picture on global sustainability and where mobility fits into that big picture. And I'm going to do it in terms of three myths facing us about the climate and the sustainability challenge. And the first one is that we have all the time in the world. We have plenty of time to act on this. We can have a slow transition, and this will solve the problem. Climate change will incrementally just get a little bit worse. We'll adapt and we'll bring in the innovations, and that'll solve it. That's not true. That's not going to happen. In the last 2 years, we're already seeing the impacts in quite a profound way, as nearer and closer to home than scientists predicted a few decades ago. In the last 2 years, we've seen 2 unprecedented heat waves in the entire northern hemisphere. Yes, we've had heat waves in Europe before, yes, in Russia before, but right the way across the northern hemisphere, in synchronous, we get them. It's phenomenal across Africa, the wildfires in California, Philippines flooding. And then in winter, we get these deep freezes that lasting much longer than previously expected. So what is happening here? And then even in the southern hemisphere, we're getting cyclones in Mozambique earlier this year. An ocean created overnight in Mozambique. And this is a year after they'd finished their flood defenses to protect the city for the next century. And the first hurricane that hits, it overwhelms it. Things are happening beyond our control. And again, in one of the world's most developed nations are seeing the biggest impacts of climate change. And of course, last week we see Hurricane Dorian hitting the US. These hurricanes are getting stronger. They're pouring more water onto the cities they're hitting, like in Houston a couple of years ago, and the frequency of these stronger hurricanes is increasing. But this is not all. I mean, you would not want to be standing where this guy is standing. I mean, he is on the edge. One little accident, he could slip and fall over. And this is where we are with planet Earth right now. We are risking tipping points in the Earth system. We have increased the temperature 1 degree above pre-industrial. We're already seeing signs of tension in key areas that could cross tipping points in the next few decades. We're already seeing shifts in the Arctic. Arctic sea ice is shrinking rapidly, driving very rapid warming in the Arctic. It's warming twice as fast as everywhere else. We're seeing permafrost melts. As that accelerates, that will cause more carbon dioxide emissions, making it more difficult to stop climate change. We're seeing ocean currents changing, slow down in the Atlantic thermohaline circulation 15% since the 1950s, with a big potential impact on the global climate. And of course, we're seeing this jet stream around the northern hemisphere beginning to waver and undulate and cause these strange weather patterns. We've had 29,000 forest fires in the Amazon in August. A phenomenal amount. The deforestation plus rising temperature could switch the Amazon from a carbon sink drawing down billions of tons of carbon to a carbon source in this century. So these are the risks we're taking. The scientific community, back in 2001, we reckoned that at 5 degrees warming, I said we're at 1.1 right now. At 5 degrees warming, it would be a very high risk for humanity, but that was a long way off. 2007, it said, 4 degrees of warming. 2013, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said, actually, now we're talking about 3 degrees where we face this very high risk. And now, the most recent report in 2018 getting risks of crossing tipping points, for example, the Greenland ice sheet, for example, the West Antarctic ice sheet, even at 1 to 2 degrees, with the potential to raise sea levels 7 to 10 meters if both of those ice sheets go. And that means constant adaptation for some of the major cities in the world, with major impacts for mobility over the next few centuries. So I will be 50 years old tomorrow. I was born on a stable, resilient planet. That is now at risk. These are my 2 kids. They're 13 and 10. They, their birthright is a stable, resilient planet. And in my lifetime, we've put that at risk. I mean, this is the consequences of it. So where do we need to go? So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change publishes 4 scenarios ranging from very, very fast, rapid reductions in emissions, the P1 scenario, through to the P4 scenario, a slow pull out of fossil fuels, but relying on negative emissions technologies, geoengineering, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage at a phenomenal scale. And there's huge risks involved in this. This will be involved creating a new industry the size of the fossil fuel industry over the next few decades to do this. It'll interfere with food security as we're growing more biofuels. And it may not work. It may not work on the scale we have and scale we need to get to. So what does that leave us with? So I've invented a new scientific terminology called the unicorn to explore the viability of some of these options. So these two, relying heavily on bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, are really unrealistic. There'd be a great risk for humanity. And this is potentially very destabilizing as an economic shift. So what we're left with is a trajectory we call the carbon law, based on Moore's law and exponential thinking in the tech sector. But the carbon law involves, instead of the Moore's law is doubling computer power as the price of chips halves, creating an economic virtuous cycle that we've been on for 50 or 60 years. This is similar, but instead we're halving carbon emissions. We need to halve carbon emissions by 2030, halve them again by 2040, and again by 2050. At the same time, ramping up these negative emissions technologies and turning our agriculture from a source of carbon to a sink of carbon. So if you remember one thing from this talk, it is that we need to cut emissions 50% by 2030. That is the job of our lifetime. This is our responsibility. So why is the carbon law thinking a useful way of thinking about the problem? It applies at all scales. It focuses on the immediate task, setting this short-term economic compass. It focuses on what's achievable. It might be very difficult to get 90% emissions reductions with current technologies, but in fact it's quite straightforward to get 50% emissions reductions in all sectors, and I'll come to that. And new business models are required to think about this exponential approach rather than incremental approach. So the second myth, it is too expensive to do this transition. This is not true. More and more research shows that a rapid transition could translate to $26 trillion in benefits to the global economy by 2030. And we see the UK, a political basket case at the moment. The only thing it could manage to do, that's successfully do in the last few months, is agree net zero emissions by 2050. Net zero emissions by 2050, because the cost of that is no different to its previous commitments to get 80% emissions reductions by 2050. And the second thing about the transition is that we've reached a tipping point. The cost of solar and wind are now within the range of fossil fuels, exactly the same range, and dropping rapidly and innovating faster. And we're seeing the same thing in mobility. And the third myth is that it's too difficult to do this. Well, we published the exponential roadmap last year at the Global Climate Action Summit, outlining the 30 solutions to bring us to halve emissions by 2030 from energy, industry, buildings, across 6 sectors. Transport. It's a combination of some very key technologies: electric vehicles, bikes, mass transit, efficient shipping. Even the shipping industry can reduce its emissions 50% simply by adopting some very basic technologies and training captains to sail more efficiently. So all of this is entirely possible. But we need the policy. It's not just about technology. We need the policy and behavioral change. That is the key critical issue. We're starting to see that coming through with policy. Several countries are setting net zero emissions targets. Norway, Sweden, United Kingdom, France, Chile, New Zealand. European Union, even Germany have these targets now under discussion. And we're seeing for the mobility side of things, 60% of new cars in Norway are electric, up from 5% just 5 years ago. In China, every 5 weeks, China adds 9,500 electric buses to its fleet. This is the same as the London fleet. But we're missing these exponential trends big time. This is the World Energy Outlook. Its colorful straight lines, flat lines here, show its predictions for photovoltaics, all flat lines. This is the black arrow is where we actually are. People really don't understand exponential trajectories. If we keep on doubling solar and wind at the pace that we currently are, we're doubling every 3 to 4 years, we'll actually reach 50% electricity coming from renewables by 2030, just keeping on the pace we are. So, to wrap up, in a couple of weeks' time, at the UN Climate Summit, we'll be launching the second roadmap, the second updated roadmap. And this will be also looking at these solutions and how do we accelerate them in more detail. What are the policy options to really get us onto that exponential trajectory? Now, is it possible to do this kind of transition in 10 years? Well, this is the Fifth Avenue in 1900, and on the right we have Fifth Avenue in 1913. I mean, just 13 years later, a complete transition, just one horse and carriage there. And as Bill Gates says, most people overestimate what we can do in a single year, but we underestimate what we can do in 10. Thank you very much.